Good evening. Welcome to Reading Grounds. Tonight it is July 28th, 2019. Let's take a look at the Wikipedia front page tonight. Today's featured article is the red-throated loon, or the red-throated diver, in case you don't want to insult the bird and accuse it of being crazy. It is a migratory aquatic bird found in the northern hemisphere. It breeds mainly in Arctic regions and winters in northern coastal waters. It is the smallest of the loons. In winter, it is a plain gray, grayish above and white below. In the breeding season, however, it has a distinctive reddish throat patch. Fish form the bulk of its diet, though amphibians, invertebrates, and plant material are also sometimes eaten. In monogamous species, the red-throated loon forms a long-term pair bond. Both members of the pair help to build the nest, incubate typically 2 eggs, and feed the hatched young. The red-throated loon has a large global population and a significant global range, though some populations are declining due to oil spills, habitat degradation, pollution, and entrapment in fishing nets. Natural predators, including various gull species and foxes, will take eggs and young. This species is protected by international treaties. Well, I learned something new today. In the news recently, incumbent president of Tunisia, Beji Caid Essebsi, died at the age of 92, and Mohamed Enakur is named as his interim replacement. In a European heatwave, national all-time temperature records are broken in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Boris Johnson succeeds Theresa May as the leader of the Conservative Party and becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The French submarine Minerva is discovered 51 years after it disappeared in the Mediterranean Sea. On the date of July 29th in history, in July 29th, 1014, during the Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars, forces of the Byzantine Empire defeated troops of the Bulgarian Empire. Forces of the Byzantine Empire defeated troops of the Bulgarian Empire at the Battle of Kleidion, in the Belasica Mountains near present-day Kiliuk, Kiliuk, Bulgaria. Don't want to get that name wrong. 1862, during the American Civil War, Confederate spy Belle Boyd was arrested by Union forces after her lover turned her in. In 1914, the first shots of World War I were fired by Austro-Hungarian river monitor SMS Bodrog upon Serbian defenses near Belgrade. In 1950, during the Korean War, the United States Army 7th Cavalry Regiment troops concluded 4 days of shootings of civilians, sparked by fears that columns of refugees might contain North Korean spies. In 2010, an overloaded passenger ferry capsized on the Kasai River in Bandundu Province, Democratic Republic of Congo, resulting in at least 80 deaths. Well, now that everybody's in a good mood, did you know that despite a ban on the National Peasants' Party taking effect on this day in 1947, the party still organized in the Romanian underground, attempting to field a candidate in the 1985 election? Did you know that Justin James was selected by the Sacramento Kings in the 2019 NBA draft, despite most mock drafts predicting he would not be picked by any team? Wow, what a news story. Part of the Malaysian Tropical Forest Reserve, Bukit Gasing, has been protected from development, while another part has been sold to building contractors. Waylon Jennings and Johnny Dollar were guest disc jockeys for the country music station KOYL in Odessa, Texas. After the U.S. banned Chinese students from returning to China, Li Hengde organized a student network which petitioned the Chinese premier, the U.S. president, and the UN for their right to go home. The Yellow-Footed Honeyguide, a species of bird, probably includes beeswax in its diet. I don't know why it's trivia, if it's a probably. A lack of help from W.B. Yeats caused one of the founders of the Ulster Literary Theatre to say, "Damn, Yeats, we'll write our own plays." riveting. Oh, geez. My trackpad on my laptop is not doing particularly well. Actually, it kind of seems like my laptop's acting up on me. There we go. That should work better. So last week, there was no archive stream. There was a stream, however. I was the only one on it, as far as I can tell. I was kind of having a tough time. I wasn't speaking very well, and I wasn't in a particularly good mood anyway. I was kind of tired. Um, and then I ended up getting a surprise text from my dad about something important. It was good news, thankfully, I hope. Or at least it wasn't bad news. How about that? Um, so I wanted to focus on that, and I couldn't do that and stream at the same time because otherwise it's just dead air, and then there's no point to any of it. So I ended up ending the stream after about half hour, 45 minutes, and then um, focused on that. Didn't really worry about anything else. And obviously the stream wasn't very good, what little there was, so I just canned it, more or less. We'll see if tonight is any better. Currently, I'm looking at that article for Belle Boyd, the Confederate spy during the Civil War. She kind of looks like a man in drag, actually. Yep, definitely looks like a man in drag. She was born in 1844 in Martinsburg, Virginia. The eldest child. She described her childhood as idyllic. Her parents were indulgent of their mischievous tomboy of a daughter, but after some preliminary schooling in Martinsburg, when she was 12 years old, they decided to send her to finishing school. Boyd's espionage career began by chance. According to her highly fictionalized 1866 account, on July 4th, 1861, a band of Union Army soldiers heard she had Confederate flags in her room, and they came to investigate. They hung a Union flag outside her home. This made her angry enough, but when one of them cursed at her mother, she was enraged. Boyd pulled out a pistol and shot the man, who died some hours later as a result of the wound he sustained. A board of inquiry exonerated her of murder, but sentries were posted around the house, and officers kept close track of her activities. She profited from this enforced familiarity, charming at least one of the officers, whom she named in her memoir as Captain Daniel Kiley. To him, she later wrote, "I am indebted for some very remarkable effusions, some withered flowers, and a great deal of important information." Boyd conveyed those secrets to Confederate officers via her slave, Eliza Hopewell, who carried the message in a hollowed-out watch case. On Boyd's first attempt at spying, she was caught and told she could be sentenced to death, but was not. She was not scared and realized she needed to find a better way to communicate. One evening in mid-May 1862, Union Army General James Shields and his staff gathered in the parlor of the local hotel. Boyd hid in the closet in the room, eavesdropping through a knothole she enlarged in the door. She learned that Shields had been ordered east from Front Royal, Virginia. That night, Boyd rode through Union lines, using false papers to bluff her way past the sentries, and reported the news to Colonel Turner Ashby, who was scouting for the Confederates. She then returned to town. When the Confederates advanced on Front Royal on May 23rd, Boyd ran to greet Stonewall Jackson's men, avoiding enemy fire that put bullet holes in her skirt. She urged an officer to inform Jackson that the Yankee force is very small. Tell him to charge right down and he will catch them all. Jackson did, and that evening penned a note of gratitude to her. I thank you for myself and for the Army for the immense service that you have rendered for your country today. For her contribution, she was awarded the Southern Cross of Honor. Jackson also gave her captain and honorary aide-de-camp positions. Boyd was arrested at least 6 times, but somehow evaded incarceration. By late July 1862, the spy detective Alan Pinkerton had assigned 3 men to work on her case. On July 29, 1862, after her lover gave her up, Boyd was finally captured by Union officials and brought to the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. the next day. An inquiry was held on August 7, 1862, concerning violations of orders that Boyd be kept in close custody. Boyd was held for a month before being released on August 29, 1862, when she was exchanged at Fort Monroe. She was arrested again in June 1863, but was released after contracting typhoid fever. In March 1864, she attempted to travel to England, where she was intercepted by a Union blockade and sent to Canada. There she met Union naval officer Samuel Wilde Hardinge. The two later married in England and had a daughter named Grace. Boyd became an actress in England after her husband's death to support her daughter. Following the death of her husband in 1866, she and her daughter returned to the United States. Boyd assumed the stage name Nina Benjamin to perform in several cities in the U.S., eventually ending up in New Orleans, where she met and married in March 1869, John Swainston Hammond, a former British Army officer who fought for the Union Army during the Civil War. The two had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Their first son died as an infant. After divorcing Hammond in 1884, Boyd married Nathaniel Rue High in 1885. She subsequently began touring the country, giving dramatic lectures of her life as a Civil War spy. Boyd published a highly fictionalized narrative of her war experiences in a 2-volume book titled Belle, Boyd, and Camp in Prison. While touring the United States, she died of a heart attack in Kilbourne City, now known as Wisconsin Dells, in Wisconsin, on June 11th, 1900. She was 56 years old. She was buried in the Spring Grove Cemetery in Wisconsin Dells, with members of the local GAR as her pallbearers. For years, her grave simply read, Belle Boyd, Confederate spy, born in Virginia, died in Wisconsin, erected by a comrade. I'm sure she erected her comrades as well. Interesting stuff, though. I could be even more mean, but what's the point in that? All right, so as far as reading goes, I don't have anything particular planned, and if nothing shows up within the first hour, I'm just gonna give it up for the night because, frankly, I'm not really in the mood. I do have some miscellaneous things I could be reading, things that don't require any particular commitment, little stories and what have you. Oops, not that. Trying to multitask here, and it's not going very well. Story of my life. I'll tell you something a little bit about myself. I have some strange fascination with very expensive pocket watches. It's not that they're expensive, it's just that they're fancy, and that happens to make them expensive, you know. I would try and show this one on stream, but um, it's an unusual image. It's not a JPEG per se. It's some sort of something that can't be opened in MS Paint, it would seem. I'm not much of a material goods sort of person. I don't really care for really most material goods, but I am a bit of a sucker for watches. Whoops. If I can only get it to work. I forgot I had saved an article that had a watch thing going on. Oops. I'm going to get this, I promise. Okay. Here's the watch I was looking at. I had to manually screenshot it and then crop it in order to save it to my computer, which I do just for reference and, occasionally to put it on stream. Something about these watches is, well, plain and simple, it's very special. It has a fantastical look to it, And I love, I'm one of those weird people that likes inspiration images, not necessarily in the sense of motivational pictures, but just things that kind of entice my imagination. Used to spend. I'm one of those people that can spend a lot of time on Pinterest, so that's one of those social media websites I've had to give up. In fact, in recent times, I've actually given up social media altogether. I've decided to just give it up entirely. I feel a little bit better, honestly. I feel like I'm in a little more control than I normally am of my impulses, as weird as that sounds, because I don't know. That's kind of what um I can't even think. That's what social media does. Is it kind of allows you to act on impulse, so you can just sit there and browse random pictures all the time. You have this impulse to just go and look at your news feed and see what fancy things are on there. And I just find that I'm in better control of my compulsions when I do that in general. Not perfect, of course, but a little better. I'm going to read this article that these pictures came from because they both came from the same, and I'm going to see. It's called The Complication by Neil Litherland on 01.media, which I guess is a website. But anyways, when pocket watches were first invented in the 16th century, they were products strictly for the wealthy and privileged. The first true mobile mechanical means of telling time, initial watches were worn around the neck, and they could be off by more than an hour. Excuse me. Due to inaccuracies of early mechanisms. It wasn't until spiral springs, the height of technology in the year 1675, were invented that accurate pocket watches could even be made. Once this technology was discovered, watches became slightly less expensive as well as significantly more accurate. Not only that, but having a timepiece meant you were a person of means, someone for whom time was a valuable commodity. It even led to an entire etiquette system regarding how to wear one's watch, chain, and fobs, as any status symbol will be accessorized just to prove your status is slightly higher than the next person. In fact, it was this idea of the pocket watch as a status symbol that gave birth to one of the most complex watches ever designed, the device known as the Supercomplication. In the 1920s, there was a competition going on in New York City between a banker and a banker and a car manufacturer as to who was top dog in the pocket watch game, and by extension, who was truly the wealthier and more sophisticated gentleman. James Packard of the Packard Car Company was one half of this competition, while the other half was banker Henry Graves Jr. The goal was to see which of them could own the more complicated timepiece, and they went to frankly absurd lengths to achieve this goal. In exchange for this ultimate status symbol, both men offered huge sums of money for watches that could be designed with complications, a term that refers to any feature of a timepiece aside from the hands that tell the seconds, minutes, and hours. While both men consulted with several different companies and artisans, it was Henry Graves who took the lead when he sought help from pocket watch powerhouse Patek Philippe, located in Geneva, Switzerland. Patek Philippe accepted a commission from Graves that was 5 years in the making, 2 years for planning and designing the watch, and another 3 to actually have it assembled in all its glory. This one-of-a-kind accessory, made of over 900 separate parts and pieces, was named the Supercomplication and was completed in the year 1933. It came with all the bells and whistles, both literally and metaphorically. Some of the complications that this watch boasted included a minute repeater that played the chimes of London's Big Ben, an automatic correction for leap years, the exact time of sunrise and sunset in New York City, and an astronomical sky map of the firmament above Graves's New York home. All told, the watch possessed 24 separate complications, all wrapped up in an 18-karat gold case with enameled and silvered gold dials. Needless to say, it was the finest timepiece in all the land. So what happened to the Supercomplication? This pocket timepiece is the most complicated in history to have ever been designed without the aid of a computer. According to New Atlas, and it took until 1989 for a watch to surpass the sheer number of extra functions presented by the Supercomplication. Incidentally, the timepiece that broke the record was another project of Patek Philippe, who decided to outdo themselves for their 150th anniversary by building a watch with 30 complications. The Supercomplication held another record for many years, though, the most expensive watch ever sold. The Supercomplication was sold in 1999 at Sotheby's for a record-setting $11 million, which was over 3 times the previous record ever paid for a pocket timekeeper. It was sold again in 2014 for a record $23 million and change. In fact, it took the sale of a pocket watch practically made of diamonds, the 201-carat Chopard watch, which sold for $25 million, to keep the Supercomplication out of the top spot. Today, it exists in the private collection of the anonymous buyer, who would understandably not want to brag about owning such a coveted piece of watchmaking art and history. Interesting. There are pictures of it on Google if you are at all curious about any of that. I don't know what it is. I just have a certain love for clocks and watches. I think as I get older and hopefully have more money, I will begin to collect fancy pocket watches. Probably not $24 million pocket watches, but nice pocket watches nonetheless. There's something very fantastical about them. Something almost like a fairy tale to me. Reminds me of some distant, almost dream. But anyways, that's one of the articles that I have saved in my Pocket list. Pocket, of course, is a computer app and phone app built in, I think, to Firefox now. Maybe, I don't think Chrome has it, but Firefox does. It essentially just allows you to bookmark things, but you can look at those bookmarks on any computer or on your phone. I used to, when I was younger, I would want to save pictures or whatever, memes that I found on the internet. Just memes, I assure you. And I would send them to myself because I would want to save them at my home computer. I was on my work computer or, whatever. So I would email the links or the pictures to myself and then go back and get them once I got home and open the email and all that. And now I don't even have to do that. I just save it to Pocket and let that pile up. I've been currently looking over this article I read that I really like. Oh, looks like Shelby's on the stream. And here I was hoping no one would show up so I could end the stream early. Anyways, so I have this article that I happened upon. I'm trying to decide if I want to read it. I suppose I could. It is a little more serious. It does get a bit religious as well. I don't intend to make this stream particularly religious. I don't think this is really an appropriate place to get preachy. At least I don't think so. Especially not when I don't take it that seriously. But it did provide an interesting perspective, which kind of changed me up a little bit. So it's an article about kind of this friend's marriage. Not my friend, the writer author's friend, whose marriage unfortunately fell apart, and talks a little bit about because their marriage counselor simply just could not help him. And so it kind of tries to explore exactly why. So I'm going to read it. This is from, I don't know if I'll read the whole thing, but this is from the website faithmatters.org, written by a guy by the name of Bill Turnbull, who looks like is either a psychologist or a licensed counselor, social worker. So I'll just go ahead and read some of that. Probably not the whole thing, but here we go. Years ago, we discovered that our good friend's marriage was on the rocks. To protect the innocent, and also because it would totally make sense if you knew them, let's call them Barbie and Ken. When we first met them, things looked great. A sharp, handsome couple with a pack of fun kids and a good life. But as we spent more time with them, it became quite obvious that Ken couldn't really stand Barbie. Everything about her annoyed him, and Barbie had little love for Ken. She had come to deeply resent him and his frequent sniping. As their marriage began to unravel, they decided to give counseling a shot. After a few sessions, the therapist reluctantly concluded that he could not help them, and the marriage ended soon after. We were shocked. These were good people. Why couldn't their marriage be saved? What did this therapist see that we didn't? The answer was that he saw the grim math of the Gottman ratio at work. John Gottman is a psychologist and clinician who made a name for himself in his research at the University of Washington on the reasons for marriage success and failure. He and his team conducted longitudinal studies of thousands of couples during the 1980s and 90s. Among their findings, in happy, healthy relationships, there was a pattern of at least 5 positive interactions to each negative interaction. Interactions can include everything from conversations to simple remarks and gesture. This 5-to-1 ratio became known as the magic ratio. The relationships in which the Gottman ratio fell below 1 to 1 had become toxic and usually ended in divorce. When our friends sat down at their first marriage therapy session, Ken was ready to air his grievances and expose Barbie for who she was. He was ready to tell his story of living for years with a woman who would drive a lesser man to drink, or worse. He brought documented evidence in the form of a journal he had been keeping for some time, listing all the things Barbie did wrong. Surely the therapist would see how flawed Barbie was and would prescribe a corrective course for her. Ken was rather disappointed to realize no such prescription was forthcoming. Here's the problem. Like many of us, Ken entered the marriage on a false premise. He had fallen in love, not with an actual person, but with his ideal of a person, a doll of his own making. As he learned all the ways in which Barbie fell short of his expectations, he tried to control and change her to conform to that ideal. When he finally figured out that wasn't going to work, he got increasingly frustrated and eventually gave up on the marriage. His expectations for Barbie were ultimately more important to him than a flesh and blood human being he had covenanted to cherish. The truth is, Ken was more interested in being right than in facing reality, especially the reality of his own stubborn ego. This precluded him from seeing a pearl of great price hidden in plain sight in front of him. He opted not to make himself vulnerable to a real, sometimes painful, but potentially very rewarding partnership. He was out. Ken failed to love Barbie. His words, his gestures, and his thoughts toward Barbie carried a subtle judgment. He parceled out complaints as if they cost him dearly. He parceled out compliments as if they cost him dearly. His Gottman ratio had fallen into the toxic range, and he was not interested in stepping back and looking at his own role in it. He was right, after all. The evidence was all there in his list. Let's see here. He does talk a bit about religion and specifically keeping people involved. In the interest of staying a little more neutral, I'd like to focus more on more of the psychology aspect of it. So he goes on to talk about his own personal experience. He says, like most of us, I didn't really know my spouse when I married her. I was in love partly with my own idea of who she was, i.e., I was in love with my expectations. It took a while for me to fully understand that those expectations were not reality, and they were not healthy. They were a false lens of my own making and prevented me from fully seeing the pearl of great price in front of me. Ultimately, I had to give up my ideas and expectations of Susan before I could truly see her and be in a deep relationship with her. I had to create a pattern of positive interactions, complimenting her, acknowledging her gifts, avoiding judgment or criticism. As I let go of expectations and got my Gottman ratio in line, I created space and soil for a real relationship to bloom. And it did. Unexpected and even miraculous things can emerge from a real relationship. Relationship is a crucible, a container in which different elements interact under intense heat, leading to creation of something new. This applies to... Right. These relationships can bless and nurture us immensely, but can also disappoint us and hurt us at times. We need to remember the good times. A negativity bias is a powerful reality of neurobiology. It can take control of us if we let it. The important thing to remember is that we are responsible for the energy that we bring to our relationships. We need to realize that thoughts are energy. When we think of a thought, we are quite literally creating new energy in the world. Thoughts are real things and have real effects. Think how the energy of a thought, positive or negative, can rapidly cascade through the systems of the body. That same energy can be transmitted to others. In that sense, our communications, words, and gestures are also forms of new energy that ripple out and have real effects in the world. That's pretty heavy stuff, and that's not even getting into the religious aspect, which is more intended for people who are members of the faith, and rather than just about faith in general necessarily. But he does include a picture of himself with his wife. Apparently, they've been married for over 40 years, which is kind of ridiculous because the picture that I can see of him, dude does not look like he's 60. kind of crazy. But the point is, I read that article kind of on a whim, and I was taken aback by it. Um, because it sounds very silly, Uh, think positive thoughts, and obviously, it's kind of a cliche. It's almost like a condescending. It feels like in a way, just think happy thoughts or whatever. But on a strictly scientific, secular level, he's right because thinking requires energy. You can't think if your body doesn't have the energy it needs to, or for the brain to process that power. It's an energy. It's a reaction of energy. And when we have positive thoughts, that courses through us and changes us. When we have negative thoughts, that courses through us and changes us. And I never considered that because I just never really thought about it. I was a psychology major for a short while, but I didn't take it especially seriously, and that was a long time ago to boot. And neurochemistry was my least favorite part of psychology, and a big reason why I got out of it because I can't, I don't do science very well. But the point is that um, while it seems obvious, while it seems condescending, while it seems kind of stupid, he's actually onto something. I shouldn't be that critical on, but my point is that, well, okay, I'm not even that critical. I'm just I tend to be that way, if that makes sense. That you have to try and approach things from a more positive aspect in order to feel positively about them. Certainly, that's true with people and relationships and really life in general. Um, Negativity bias as well is something that he's mentioned, and that's something I've struggled with for a while. I've considered myself a cynic for a long time, but finally realizing that, because we have this bad habit of trying to rely on other people to make us happy, and I know I've been kind of guilty of that, but I've also put myself in sort of this catch-22 where I don't want to be responsible for my own happiness, but I also don't trust other people to be responsible for my happiness, which is a very dangerous way to go about it. And as I look back, I'm like, okay, that was really dumb of me. And so that article and him talking about that specifically really kind of hit me hard, thinking, okay, I need to correct my own behavior. I need to try and be positive if I want to be happy. I need to think about people in a better light. And, generally I'm okay with that. Like, it's not as though I'm just a complete, I hate everyone and everything around me, but that's not to say that there wasn't room for improvement. I was still holding on to my own negativity. I was biased to it, but I was the one responsible for that. So I don't know if anyone else will be as nearly uh, inspired by that article as well as I was. Excuse me. And I realize that Shelby's the only one listening right now. And hopefully, Shelby, that wasn't a little too close to home. I know you've been kind of going through your family drama recently. But it's something, it is important because, people can show us the door that leads to happiness, but we still have to walk through it. And, especially with like relationships, because it's easy to be like, oh, I'm so lonely. I just want to hold hands and cuddle. And, well, I was going to make a dirty joke, but maybe that's below me, quite literally. But I lost my train of thought. This is why I shouldn't make bad jokes. But the point is that, as scary as it can be, or as hopeful as it can be, it's also kind of a scary thing because you do make yourself vulnerable, and committing yourself to one person, you say, okay, you're making a bet, really. You're saying, okay, this person is a good person. This person is a person I want to spend not only my time with, but the rest of my life with. That's a scary thing. There are a lot of people that never want to make that commitment. They essentially do make that commitment. They, spend the majority of their life with someone else, living with them or whatever, but they never commit to it. That scares them because it's a scary thing. But another thing is, controlling your emotions. That's something I've struggled with in general since I was a kid. Thankfully, I'm a little better about it now. But, I used to just let fear and anger take control of me because I just felt like I couldn't control them. And maybe for a while I couldn't. But now as an adult, having some more self-control, some discipline, having some context for what I'm doing. Yeah, and like Shelby said, people kind of change when you get married to them. Especially because like when someone gets married young, they've got a lot of growing up to do. Even if they're mature already, they're going to change. And I'm going to say that generally that maturity can be a good thing. Ah, jeez, that was loud. But again, it is a scary thing. Come on. You have to do the best you can, obviously. And that requires, your own effort. It's a real temptation to just it's a real temptation to just kind of push responsibility off to someone else. And sometimes, you're not always responsible for it, obviously. A lot of people will willingly or unwillingly abuse a relationship or trust. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't exist. I would say that honestly, like a lot of the people that I've trusted in the past, probably the majority of people that I've trusted in the past have betrayed that trust or exploited it or done something with it. And I'm not saying that, to throw myself a pity party. I'm just saying that because that's how it went. They weren't even trying to, well, I won't say that. They weren't necessarily trying to exploit me, but sometimes that's how it turned out. So again, it's a temptation to just say, it's everyone else. Kind of like that article pointed out that the husband just wanted to blame his wife. And, it takes two to tango. It's possible that, obviously I don't know the whole story. It's possible that maybe she could have done more. Maybe not. Point is that that man, whoever he was, faced that choice. And maybe he didn't realize that he had that choice. Maybe he didn't even want to think about making that choice. Maybe he just wanted it to be somebody else's choice. Because again, marriage is a scary thing. But it's important to remember that we do have a choice when we approach a situation. And some situations are easier than others. I know that. But we are still responsible for ourselves, And there are people that, are impoverished, that are that have terrible health, and they still find a way to be positive. Maybe they're scared or they're hurt or they're doomed, but they don't. That's not the end of the world for them, even though they're doomed. And again, it's heavy stuff. It's not a simple like bibbity bobbity boo. Now you'll never be afraid again. But it's important for us to try and do our best. And that doesn't just mean letting somebody else control everything about us. That means that we have to be active in that. And a lot of people get passive when they get married. I especially feel like a lot of men get passive when they get married. Not always necessarily to, an awful extent, but enough to a point where you're like, well, what are you doing, Anyways, like I said, it's scarier than it seems on the surface, relationships. But no one wants to be alone either, so maybe life is just miserable and you need to find a way to get over it. Anyways, so this is the last week of summer classes. Or I should say summer class, since I only have the one. I've got my imaginative writing course. And the final project is a radical revision, where we take one of our previous writings and change it in a radical way. I ended up writing this nonfiction story about something that's kind of uncanny that happened to me. Um, and then a little while later, I was kind of thinking about it, and something else that was uncanny and sort of reminded me of that situation happened in my life. And kind of happened twice, actually, like in the same night. Hard to explain, but I ended up, like, the day after I went to class and I was thinking about it, and I started kind of writing this new idea down. And so I ended up developing this poem, which I'm hoping to get done before the end of the semester so that I can turn it in and not fail the final assignment. Because that would be really embarrassing to be an English major and to fail a single summer class that I've been otherwise cruising through. Because this has been a real easy class, thankfully. A lot of fun, a lot of new stuff I've been learning. But hopefully that poem will be done. And maybe I'll share it here. I don't know. We'll see how I feel about it. But, excuse me. Let's see here. I'm not sure how much longer I want to keep reading because I'm kind of out of material anyway, or at least I'm slowing down a bit. I've been reading, I've mentioned that I've been reading a book from a local author. It's called Jane Doe 17. It's a psychological thriller about this woman who ends up in a coma after escaping from the clutches of a serial killer. She gets hit by a car, um, and the people that rescue her start having like these visions involving the serial killer. Unfortunately, it's not as well written as it could be. It's not that it's not an interesting book. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff in there, but it's very, very, uh, well, it needs work. That's the nice way to say it, which is unfortunate because it's like it's a cool thing, and it doesn't make me angry reading it. Like, I've read some books where I'm just like, okay, this is terrible. Why am I reading this? But this one, it's like, oh, wish she had done a little more work because then I could recommend it. And I've been even committing a cardinal sin for somebody like me where I've just been like kind of skipping passages to get through it because unfortunately the author puts down like long passages of mundane things that don't actually contribute anything. She put a lot of work into it, you can tell, but and she printed it and had a book at Comic-Con, and she was a real nice lady. Like I met her personally, talked to her about writing and all that stuff. Met her again at the League of Utah Writers, actually, their spring conference. She was one of the volunteers there. Real nice lady. Don't have anything bad to say about her. Her book needs work, which is unfortunate. But hopefully I'll get that done soon. I'm actually hoping that I'll get around to reading And Then There Were None, which was lent to me by Shelby, who is the only person listening to this, so I don't know why I'm even talking about her like she's not here. My boss at work, he's a historian by trade. He had mentioned that he had some book that he was like, yeah, I think you might like it. I think it was like a kind of a short book, like almost like one of those booklets or novellas. So I'm thinking I want to read And Then There Were None, or maybe talk to my boss about that book that he has and see if I can get that one read. But I'm hoping to actually get along and start reading some other stuff. I haven't been reading really very much. I only read when I go to work, because otherwise I get distracted with basically anything else. Shelby says you can. I mean, it's going to be a while before I can actually get around to reading it, Shelby. If you want it, like, I'll give it back to you, and then if I have time, I'll just borrow it back or get my own copy or something. But I've been, part of me is like, because I'm an aspiring fantasy author, but common advice from big name authors is they say read outside of the genre, which kind of makes sense to me because even though I love fantasy in theory, I mean, it's Sturgeon's law. 90% of everything is not good. 99% even. And that's, I haven't read a whole lot of fantasy, unfortunately, but, as much as I love some fantasy in concept, a lot of it is, it's not very stimulating. How's that? Sometimes it's titillating, but that's not what I'm looking for. Oh, what did Terry Pratchett say? Terry Pratchett had something about that. Let's see here. Terry Pratchett was a higher profile fantasy. Shelby's saying that she's super busy and exhausted, so reading is the last thing she thinks about. I kind of get the same way. I mean, I have a plethora of excuses, but like sometimes I think about it, I'm like I should go home and read before I go to bed. But then I'm like, okay, I need to make dinner once I get home because I haven't eaten, because I go to work at 4, and that's, there's no time to eat dinner 2 hours after lunch. Um, I go to work at 4, get back at 9:30, and I need to eat. So I'm not going to eat and read at the same time. I can't do that. That's gross. So, I end up watching like something on YouTube anyway. And then like, I'm so tired anyway that it's like, I can't really pay attention. So I don't even, ugh, all I can do is watch a video. Anyway, so Terry Pratchett, the late great Terry Pratchett, is one of the most prolific fantasy authors there's been. He's known for his series, The Discworld, but more than that, uh, he's known for his sense of humor. He was a very witty guy, and he loved to poke fun at tropes and ideas. And so most of Discworld books were um, making fun of fantasy or poking fun at it or some other concept. Anyways, but there was a particular quote here which I remember because it always made me laugh. He said, "Now there is a tendency at a point like this to look over one's shoulder at the cover artist and start going on at length about leather, tight boots, and naked blades. Words like full, round, and even pert creep into the narrative until the writer has to go and have a cold shower and a lie down, which is all rather silly because any woman setting out to make a living by the sword isn't going or about to go around looking like something off the cover of a more advanced kind of lingerie catalog for the specialized buyer. Oh well, all right. The point that must be made is that although Helena the henna-haired Heredin would look quite stunning after a good bath, a heavy-duty manicure, and a pick of the leather racks in Wu Hun Ling's Oriental Exotica and Marital Aids on Hero Street, she was currently quite sensibly dressed in light chainmail, soft boots, and a short sword. All right, maybe the boots were leather, but not black. Anyways, Terry Pratchett's a real goofy guy. Or he was. Unfortunately, he passed away. He has other shorter, more witty quotes like "Give a man a fire and he'll be warm for a day, but set fire to him and he's warm for the rest of his life." Or another one, "Some humans would do anything to see if it was possible to do it. If you put a large switch in some cave somewhere with a sign on it saying 'End of the world switch, please do not touch,' the paint wouldn't even have time to dry." Here's one that's actually kind of profound. He said, "It is true that your life flashes before your eyes just before you die. That is true. It is called life." Oh, here's one that I particularly like. Why do you go away? So that you can come back. So that you can see the place you came from with new eyes and extra colors, and the people there see you differently too. Coming back to where you started is not the same as never leaving." Let's see here. Or his little quip about the Big Bang. He says, "In the beginning there was nothing, which exploded," which is always how I've seen it, although never in such humorous terms. It's not worth doing something unless someone, somewhere, would much rather you weren't doing it. Let's see here. Scouring his Goodreads quote. Shelby says, "Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Don't teach a man how to fish and you feed yourself. He's a grown man. Fishing isn't that hard." Sounds like something Pratchett would maybe say. If you trust in yourself and believe in your dreams and follow your star, you'll still get beaten by people who spent their time working hard and learning things and weren't so lazy. Here's one that's a bit saucy. He says, "Just erotic, nothing kinky. It's the difference between using a feather and using a chicken." Well said, sir. Well said. There's one quote here. Let's see. It's him and Neil Gaiman, who did The Sandman, wrote a book called Good Omens, which has its own miniseries, I think, on Amazon Prime. Um, I have bought the book. I have not read it. I've been kind of reluctant because I think it might not be what I was hoping for, and I keep finding other things to read and all that. Anyways, the quote is, "She was beautiful, but she was beautiful in a way a forest fire was beautiful. Nothing to be admired from, something to be admired from a distance, not up close." It reminds me of a different quote, kind of similar to that one. Yes, okay. This one's actually by Bo Taplin, Sea Storm. There was something tremendously powerful about her, like the sea. It never mattered. It never mattered whether she was still and serene or in the throes of a storm. There was always a danger of drowning. Love it. I'm not normally like. I mean, there are plenty of. They call them word porn, which is not necessarily what I would deign to call them. I don't really. There's a lot of people that like that stuff. I don't generally do. I think most of them are kind of vapid. That one though, I kind of relate to. Here's another quote. Human beings make life so interesting. Do you know that in a universe so full of wonders, they have managed to invent boredom? There's truth to that. There was Terry Pratchett and then there was Douglas Adams, but I have to say I don't care for Douglas Adams nearly so much. Something about him just I don't think is that funny. But I do have a general appreciation for Terry Pratchett. Wherever you go, there you are. Think about that. Hmm. Let's see here. I actually do have like a list of notes, and some of them are quotations. So let's pull that up. Let's see if there's any that are good enough to read on stream. Here's kind of a funny one. The enemy with the high ground does not negotiate. So if someone's trying to negotiate, they do not have the high ground over you. There was one quote from that book I read, Beyond the Cabin, about midway through it, a little more than midway through it. He's the main character is complaining about the cult that he lives in and the adults that run it for being incompetent buffoons and hypocrites and all that stuff. And he said something that really struck me. It was a good chapter in general, but I loved this one. He said, "How could they think that separating themselves from the world could make any difference of it?" Which I even honestly goes back to kind of goes back to that other thing about positive thinking. If you want to make a difference, if you want to change something, you've got to be part of it, or at least replace it in some way. Here's one by William Faulkner. As the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. Hmm. I may have quoted this one, but I did a report on William Penn uh, last semester for my history class, and I also quoted him in my communications class. William Penn was the guy who founded Pennsylvania. He named it after his father, actually. Real interesting guy. Wrote a constitution long before the United States Constitution, and his constitution ended up influencing the latter. He said in this constitution for Pennsylvania, men side with their passions against their reason, and their sinister interests have so strong a bias upon their minds that they lean to them against the good of the things they know. Essentially saying that people would rather side with passion and bias than things that they know are good. Here's another one. It's attributed to Marcus Aurelius, the last great Roman emperor, who was a philosopher, a Stoic, I think. He had quite a few quips, which are great. He said, It's attributed to him, it may not have been him. He said, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." So true. Another one, not by Marcus Aurelius, but by Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, perhaps the greatest Spanish novel ever written. Time ripens all things. No man is born wise. Bishops are made of stone. Bishops are made of men and not of stones. Essentially saying that you have to grow into being something great. He also said, Miguel Cervantes, he said, "Diligence is the mother of good fortune." You are king by your own fireside as much as any monarch in his throne. A friend of mine, actually, from that I go to church with, he said, I don't even think he meant to be witty. But he said it and I liked it. He said, "Nobody has ever regretted doing the right thing." Sometimes we hesitate when we face a decision, a crossroad, and sometimes we let our own, uh, we ignore our judgment, even though knowing that something is good, or forgetting that something is good, and we choose a different path instead. Robert Frost once wrote, "A mother takes 20 years to make a man of her boy, and another woman makes a fool of him in 20 minutes." Now, I'm not, well, I was going to say I'm not particularly sappy. That's actually not true. I've gotten considerably more sappy as of late. But there is an author, I can never pronounce his last name. It's spelled Goethe, and I think it's pronounced Goethe. I'm not sure. But Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. As far as I can tell, that's how it's pronounced. He wrote a bit about love. One quote that I have written down here: "I'm gazing at church and palace, ruin and column, like a serious man making sensible use of a journey. But soon it will happen, and all will be one vast temple, love's temple, receiving its new initiate." Another one which he wrote, which I find myself relating to. He said, "Beloved, don't fret that you gave yourself so quickly. Believe me, I don't think badly or wrongly of you. The arrows of love are various. Some scratch us, but our hearts suffer for years from their slow poison. But others are strong-feathered, with freshly sharpened points, pierce to the marrow and quickly inflame the blood. In the heroic ages, when gods and goddesses loved, desire followed a look, and joy followed desire. Essentially saying that desire gives way to joy, and that desiring a person doesn't necessarily make you foolish, um, but that's it's part of life's fire, if you will. St. Augustine of Hippo made an interesting remark. He said, the mind commands the body and is instantly obeyed. The mind commands itself and meets resistance. Henry David Thoreau once wrote, "How vain it is to sit down to write when you have not stood up to live." There's one about making mistakes. It's an aphorism with no particular attribution. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Essentially saying that it's about perfectionism, basically. I had a college professor who once said, it's not perfectionism, it's imperfectionism. Because you look around you and all you see is imperfection. And I try and keep that in perspective because I tend to be an imperfectionist. Let's see. Another one that's quite catchy, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but he says, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Here's a bit from Hamlet. Um, It is better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Yeah, I think about that one a lot. That's why I try not to talk. And then I started a podcast and kind of ruined that masquerade. Um, Polonius from Hamlet. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy. Rich, not gaudy, for the apparel oft proclaims the man. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the day the night, thou canst not then be false to any man. Cato the Elder was once quoted with saying that if you grasp the subject, the words will follow. So essentially, it's less important to memorize something and more just to understand it. I find that my memory is not very precise, so that if I want to really understand something, I have to essentially understand it instead of memorize it. Let's see here. There's one. This was from another religious article. I don't remember what it was, but he was kind of talking about parenthood. And he said, I feel like a guy on the shore of a massive lake, looking back at the other side where I once stood. My clothes are wet and my muscles ache, but I can't really explain how I made it across. I like that. So that wasn't all my quotes, of course, but that was the ones that were kind of interesting, or at least pertinent. Let's see here. I've got some other notes here. Most of them aren't particularly interesting, but I think there might be some. Let's see here. I do have one that's about medicine or psychology. Um, I wrote down one called cataplexy, which is a medical condition in which strong emotion or laughter can cause a person to suffer sudden physical collapse though remaining conscious. Interesting. There is a mental disorder called the delirium of negation, a mental illness in which a person believes they are dead, dying, do not exist, are putrefying, or have lost their blood and or internal organs. Statistics say denial of self-existence is a symptom present of 45% of patients with Cotard syndrome. Yet, paradoxically, 55% of patients present delusions of immortality. Mild cases are characterized by despair and self-loathing, while severe cases are characterized by intense delusions of negation and chronic psychiatric depression. The case of Mademoiselle X describes a woman who denied the existence of parts of her body and of her need to eat. She said that she was condemned to eternal damnation and therefore could not die a natural death. Naturally, she did die of starvation. Not much of a joke there. That actually happened. Let's see here. People can sometimes experience what they call a dissociative fugue. Ansel Bourne was a 19th century evangelical preacher in Rhode Island. He then experienced partial amnesia in 1857, and before then was a carpenter. Then in January of 1887, he simply forgot who he was and started a new life in Pennsylvania as a stationer and confectioner under the name A.J. Brown. In March, he awakened in the morning as Ansel once again, with no memory of the preceding months, still believing it was January. He returned home with assistance from his nephew. It became the study of Harvard psychologists who found that when placed under hypnosis, he could be induced to assume either the persona of Bourne or Brown, with neither having knowledge of the other. Pretty rare, of course, but here's a little bit on the history of executioners. From the 15th century to the 19th, executioners in Germany and France were not only torturers or inquisitors, but were also knackers, who removed animal carcasses and turned them into byproducts, or also as physicians who could set bones, make medicines, or procure human body parts used in a variety of remedies, sometimes called executioner medicine. One such remedy was known as hangman's grease, or poor sinner's fat, because it was believed to work as a salve when applied to limbs suffering from lameness or restricted blood flow, arthritic joints, and it even aided in the mending of broken bones. It was, of course, a commodity that executioners had access to in quantity, and allowed many of them to work as pharmacists and apothecaries, as well as doctors and surgeons. Other body parts salvaged from executed criminals were also used in medicinal practices of the era. Ground human skull was mixed into drinks for those suffering from epilepsy, and it was believed that poor sinners' blood could also cure the seizures of epilepsy. Human skin was tanned and made into belts to be worn by pregnant women to ease labor pains, or chokers to be worn for the prevention of goiters. Wow. Kind of grisly. I have a little bit on Mandragora officinarum. Officinarum? I'm not sure. It's mandrake. Mandrake has a long history of medicinal use, although superstition has played a large part in the uses to which it has been applied. It is rarely prescribed in modern herbalism. The root is hallucinogenic and narcotic. In sufficient quantities, it induces a state of unconsciousness and was used as an anesthetic for surgery in ancient times. In the past, juice from the finely grated root was applied externally to relieve rheumatic pains. It was also used internally to treat melancholy, convulsions, and mania. When taken internally in large doses, however, it is said to excite delirium and madness. Something to think about. Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychoanalytical theory, um, his term, he invented a term called the narcissism of small difference for his observation that people with minor differences tend to be more combative and hateful than those major differences, which can be seen in college or sports rivalries. Did you know that the medical term for a limb that is quote unquote fallen asleep is obdormition? Let's see here. All right, last one. After hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic, after World War One, when Germany was being bullied by all the other countries, there was a term which may or may not have been an actual mental disorder, but was reported called zero stroke or cipher stroke. Uh, the disorder was primarily characterized by the desire of patients to write endless rows of zeros, also referring to as ciphers, which is believed to have been responsible for the been a response to the hyperinflation of the currency. I heard a story, I think it was about the Weimar Republic, about how a man had a wheelbarrow full of cash, dollar bills of the country's currency, but then he got mugged. They kicked him and turned over his wheelbarrow, left the cash, and then took the wheelbarrow because that was more valuable than all the money inside of it. Fun stuff. Anyways, that's all for tonight. I hope it's been fun. Good night. I agree. Dang it. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna get this.